Is God the same as the good? Do these two terms mean the same thing? How could it possibly work to say God is the good and the good is God? When we looked at the ontological argument, we identified a maximally great being, which means he would have to be morally perfect, meaning he would not have any vices, moral imperfections, and always know the moral decision to make. However, when we looked at the ontological implications of objective moral values and duties through our form of the moral argument, we saw that these moral values and duties lead to the need for a necessary rational source, which is the good and who we call God. But how does this work? How can God be what is literal goodness and not simply just a being that is morally perfect or conforms to what is good? The first thing we need to note about objective moral values and duties is they must be grounded in something. It doesn't seem rational to say they simply exist ad hoc. For example, the laws of physics are grounded in the existence of the universe. What we call the laws of physics are simply properties of matter and descriptions of what matter naturally does in space-time. The laws of logic are descriptions of everything that exists and everything that is possible. So the laws of logic can be said to be grounded in the existence of everything. So the moral law would have to be grounded as well. However, they are very much different than the laws of logic and the laws of physics. These laws simply describe what happens, whereas the moral law prescribes what moral agents ought to do. So they cannot be grounded in the descriptions of reality, like the laws of logic are, or like the laws of physics are grounded in the physical universe.
IP says the laws of logic and physics are grounded in the descriptions of reality, and that since moral laws are prescriptive, they cannot be grounded in the descriptions of reality like the laws of logic or physics are. We first need to get a better idea on what grounding is. Most philosophers think grounding is unanalyzable, or primitive, hence, it will be instructive to look at some paradigmatic examples of grounding. Jonathan Schaeffer offers some clear examples of grounding. IP's example of the laws of physics being grounded by the physical universe is an example of 5 truths are grounded by truth makers. The way the physical universe is, makes it true what the laws of physics are. Notice that in none of these examples is the grounder identical to the grounded. Grounding is irreflexive. Nothing grounds itself. Eric Wielenberg points out, it might be thought that divine command theory provides a foundation for such ethical facts. Doesn't the theory tell us, for instance, that the fact that the good exists is grounded in the fact that God exists? The answer is no, since the good just is God. The existence of God cannot explain or ground the existence of the good. The claim that God serves as the foundation of the good is no more sensible than the claim that H2O serves as the foundation of water. William Lane Craig says, the sort of grounding I have in mind for moral values and duties is informative identification. Moral values are identified with certain attributes of God, and moral duties with what God commands. It seems that Wielenberg is thinking of grounding, along the lines of Schaeffer, while Craig thinks of it differently, as an informative identification, like water equals H2O. Since IP thinks that the good is grounded in God, while at the same time the good is identical to God, he is also thinking of grounding in terms of an informative identification. Yet IP uses Schaeffer's view of grounding for physics and logic, while using informative identifications to ground moral properties. He wants to use the grounding of physics and logic to support the grounding of moral properties, yet his analogy rests on this equivocation of grounding. We can also think of the point another way. If the moral law needs to be informatively identified, why doesn't the laws of physics, or logic, need to be informatively identified as well? After all, they are both laws. We could informatively identify the laws of physics as being identical with physical reality, but it seems incoherent to say that the laws of physics just are physical reality. One could question why an informative identification is required. We don't informatively identify roundness with anything concrete in the world, since nothing in the world is perfectly round. Yet we can speak truly when we say a basketball is round. Why does the good need an informative identification, or an ontological grounding, while roundness does not? Perhaps IP will say that laws require grounding, and we need to ground the moral law. But goodness is a value property and not the moral law. That would be to confuse values with duties.
If we were to see three people, we could describe their interactions logically, but we could not deduce from the logical or physical descriptions that one ought not to kill the other two. So the moral law, which is objective prescriptions, cannot be grounded like objective descriptions are. Second, prescriptions only exist between agents. Without agents, prescriptions would not exist. As Francis J. Beckwith and Greg Kolk said, a command only makes sense when there are two minds involved, one giving the command and one receiving it. If objective moral values and duties are prescriptions to us and not created or determined by us, then this implies they are grounded in a prescriber, a personal mind promulgating the moral law, as G.E.M. Anscombe noted. This also correlates with other arguments Peter S. Williams lays out in his paper, explaining why moral values and duties infer theism. Take moral obligations. He says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, like the evolutionary history of my species, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons, or groups thereof, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are most fundamentally obligated. The point being that obligations cannot exist by themselves. Obligations exist when one agent gives one to another. You can obligate me to protect you, and that duty you prescribed would exist between us. However, if we have moral objective obligations beyond the mere human level in the existence of objective moral duties, then they would have to be grounded in a personal and rational source. As Richard Taylor said, a duty is something that is owed due, and to be obligated is, literally, to be bound. But something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. That is something that is owed, but owed to no person or persons. The idea of an obligation higher than this, and referred to as moral obligation, is clear enough provided reference to some lawmaker higher. But what if this higher than human lawgiver is no longer taken into account? Does the concept of moral obligation still make sense? The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible, apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. So if there are objective moral obligations or duties that we were given, and not mere human constructs, it naturally means there is a personal source of these obligations. It doesn't make sense to say the obligations simply exist without a personal source. The third way objective moral values and duties imply a necessary and personal source is the existence of the moral ideal or the concept of what is perfect. It makes sense when we say a person is morally good, but it seems incoherent to say moral goodness exists by itself as a necessary abstraction. Moral goodness and moral badness seem to be properties of agents. Thus, it is far more rational if moral values and duties are properties of agents, not mere abstractions.
Similarly, J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig write, it is difficult to comprehend this view. What does it mean to say, for example, that the moral value justice just exists? It is hard to know what to make of this. It is clear what is meant when it is said that a person is just, but it is bewildering when it is said that in the absence of any people, justice itself exists. Moral values seem to exist as properties of persons, not as mere abstractions. In response, Eric Wielenberg points out that if goodness must be a property of agents, then it is a problem for the view that God equals good, for then good wouldn't be a property of an agent, rather, it is the agent itself. Ultimately, on both views, I think people can have the property of goodness. If goodness is abstract, then people can have the property of goodness by exemplifying goodness, in the same way roundness is abstract and basketballs have the property of roundness by exemplifying roundness. A divine command theorist could say God equals the good, and people can have the property of goodness by resembling God. One disadvantage that divine command theorists have is that they have a disunified account for goodness and roundness. Divine command theorists cannot say roundness is grounded in God, so they need an additional metaphysics for other properties.
Lastly, there is the existence of moral guilt. This is not as strong as the other arguments, and I would say it only works in conjunction with the previous arguments, and if it is treated as a probabilistic argument. Beckworth argues moral guilt and shame seem to be inadequate if the moral law isn't grounded in a personal and sentient source. Why should we feel guilt towards abstract moral principles? If moral values and duties are mere abstractions, there is no reason to feel guilty when we break the moral law and did not cause harm or problems for another person. However, if there is a transcendent personal source of the moral law, then it makes sense to say we feel guilt for breaking the moral law. As Peter S. Williams says, since it would be inappropriate to feel guilt or shame before an abstract, impersonal moral principle, and since it is appropriate to feel guilt and shame before the objective moral law, that moral law cannot be an abstract moral principle. In other words, objective moral values must be ontologically grounded in a transcendent personality, before whom it is appropriate to feel moral guilt.
This objection is confused. You wouldn't feel guilt towards an abstract moral principle. That would only be the case if the abstract principle stated, you ought to feel guilt towards an abstract moral principle. Instead, the principle could be, you ought to love your neighbor as yourself, and you would feel guilt towards persons. Divine command theorists also need to appeal to an abstract principle. On a pure divine command theory, obligations are identical with, or constituted by God's commands. The problem is that there is at least one obligation that God can't command, namely, the obligation to obey God's commands. Therefore, a pure divine command theory is false. This objection was raised by Ralph Cudworth, a 17th-century philosopher. Kevin Harris explains the problem.
Finally, objection 10, modified divine command theory is self-defeating on moral obligations. A moral obligation is something that we ought to do. For instance, if we see someone drowning and we have the ability to save them, we ought to go in and save the person. Modified divine command theory claims that our moral obligations and prohibitions are directly constituted by a loving God's commands. But this is self-defeating, because if our moral obligations are constituted by God's commands, where does our moral obligation to follow God's commands come from? Does God issue a command to follow His commands? What about the obligation to follow that command? This quickly falls into an infinite regress problem.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and I think there's two possible ways to respond to it. One would be to affirm the infinite regress, but say it's non-vicious. And I think that is the case here. You're obligated to obey God's commands because He commands you to. And you're obligated to obey His commands because He commands you to do that. And as far as I can see, this is a benign infinite regress. There isn't any viciousness to this. It would be like an infinite regress, like the proposition P is true, and the proposition that P is true, and the proposition that P is true, is true, and that will go on to infinity. That's a benign infinite regress. There's no viciousness there.
A vicious infinite regress then would be something that kind of undermines it?
Yes, it would be where at every level there's a contradiction.
Okay.
There is some incoherence, and there isn't one here. So it seems to me that if there is an infinite regress, it's benign. But what I suggest, and he quotes me on this, is that we don't need to have the infinite regress. We can just say, this is my theory of obligation. My theory of obligation is that obligations arise from the commands or imperatives of a competent authority. And that seems to me to be a very plausible account of what constitutes a moral obligation.
The questioner asks, why should we obey God's commands? Where does that should come from? How is that should grounded in God?
Right. This relates to the question that came up a little bit in the debate about whether or not your moral theory has some sort of explanatory ultimate which cannot be further explained. And it seems to me the divine command theorist could say simply that This is my theory, that divine commands constitute our moral obligations. And therefore, the question arises, doesn't even arise, well, why should I obey God's commands? Because that just is the theory that you're giving. And this is an explanatory ultimate that doesn't have a further explanation. Seems to me that would be perfectly legitimate move. But he could say something else. He could say that we are to obey God's commands because God has commanded us to. And that would not be viciously circular. For example, all of the things mentioned in the debate tonight is itself mentioned in the debate tonight. So there are things that are included in themselves. And if God issues a command, you shall obey all of my commands, that command itself would be comprised in that command. And so in this case, you're not left with some sort of brute explanatory ultimate. Rather, you would have an explanation for why you should obey God's commands, because God has commanded you to obey all his commands, including that one.
The problem with this response is that not just anyone can generate an obligation for you by commanding you to obey all his commands. For example, an incompetent person commanding you to obey all his commands wouldn't generate obligations. Craig would still need to appeal to his theory that obligations arise from the commands of a competent authority, which is an abstract principle.
So these arguments lead us to the conclusion moral values and duties are grounded in a rational necessary source that would have to be a mind or agent. Now some object and ask, why can't moral oughts exist like other normative oughts? For example, we believe we ought to strive to be intelligent, or we believe we ought to accept the conclusion of a logically valid and sound argument. There are oughts we believe to be objectively true, and we don't infer they are prescribed by a necessary rational source. It is simply true we ought to do these things in and of themselves, as Reducibility argued. Not all normative laws require lawmakers. For instance, the laws of logic and rationality are normative. They tell us what we ought to do. But no one invented them. If you have excellent evidence for one claim, and this entails a second claim, then you should believe that second claim. If you are faced with contradictory propositions, and you know that one of them is false, then you must accept the other. However, the problem with saying moral oughts are the same as other normative oughts is in their status. If someone were to reject the conclusion of a valid and sound argument, we simply argue they are not being practical or reasonable. It is not the same as if to say they broke an objective law in not being rational. Williams responds to Schaeffer-Landau by saying, when Schaeffer-Landau writes that if you have excellent evidence for one claim, and this entails a second claim, then you should believe that second claim, he equivocates between moral and pragmatic senses of the word should. Logic qua logic has nothing to say about what objectively ought to be the case, morally speaking. Logic can tell us that if we want to accept whatever conclusion is validly deducible from certain premises, then such and such is the conclusion that we should accept. But this is a pragmatic if-then ought. Logic can't tell us that we have a categorical moral obligation to be reasonable or to value truth over falsehood.
Williams says logic qua logic can tell us about pragmatic oughts, but not categorical oughts. This is false. It tells us about neither. IP uses the example epistemic norm. We ought to strive to be intelligent. How could this norm be derived from logic qua logic? If anything, it would be fundamental. In this God equals good video, IP says epistemic norms are pragmatic, but in his video defending moral realism, IP says epistemic norms are not pragmatic. He can't have it both ways.
The first argument is the argument from epistemic realism, put forward by Terence Cuneo. The argument is as follows. Premise 1. If moral facts do not exist, then epistemic facts do not exist. Premise 2. Epistemic facts do exist. Conclusion 1. Moral facts do exist. Premise 3. If moral facts do exist, then moral realism is true. And the final conclusion is, moral realism is true. The problem that Cuneo identifies is how can a moral skeptic prescribe epistemic oughts while rejecting moral oughts? They are almost identical in how they operate. This can be explained by an example. If someone replies to this video with an argument for moral relativism, and I decide to reply, they will assume epistemic duties must be present in our debate. For instance, they will assume that I ought not misrepresent their argument and pretend to have refuted them. I cannot rely on logical fallacies. I should be honest in responding to what they say and not lie. The moral skeptic assumes these things ought to be done in a philosophical debate. They prescribe epistemic duties such as these and believe they should be kept and abided by. But that is precisely the problem. Why should I if it is all relative? Some could object that we hold to these epistemic duties because they have pragmatic value in discussing what is true and reasonable, not because they are objectively binding. If you don't want to abide by them, it shows you don't value reason and truth. So we do it because it is pragmatic. But all I have to ask is, why is it the case that we ought to be pragmatic? Why is the skeptic prescribing this duty? Is it honorable and right to try and be pragmatic in reasonable debates? Why should we value reason and truth? We are still assuming epistemic duties that are objectively binding.
So, IP argues that epistemic norms are objective when arguing for moral realism, and then he argues that epistemic norms are pragmatic when arguing for divine command theory. He has to drop one of those arguments.
Let us return to our original question. How can God be the good? How does this work? How can moral goodness be a being? Should we not say all beings can be morally good? Not that one being is the same as the good? Well, building on the previous arguments we gave, the evidence implies there is a personal aspect to moral values and duties. This is important to remember moving forward. We also should realize the line between abstractions and objects is often blurred in cases like this. For example, we could say your personality, will, values, and duties are grounded in you. However, if we were to remove these things from you, in reality, you would no longer be you. These things are grounded in you, but they also make you who you are essentially. In the same way, the good is grounded in God, but God is also the good.
This is a bad analogy. Earlier, IP said values seem to be properties of agents. Now he's trying to explain how it is coherent that goodness is not a property of God, but rather God just is the good. To support this, IP says my values are grounded in me, in the same way good is grounded in God. But this is false. The disanalogy is that in the former case, the grounder is distinct from the grounded, while in the latter case, the grounder is identical to the grounded. The two types of grounding are not the same.
I need some clarity real quick, because earlier, Michael, you said that moral obligations, moral duties are irreducible. So how can they, on your view, be grounded in God?
Well, grounding and reducing are two different things. If you're going to say they're reducible, they're reducible to smaller parts. I would say they're grounded in and of themselves within a necessary rational source. So, you got to remember there's a difference between reductionism and grounding. These are different things within ontology.
IP is confused about grounding and reduction. IP's type of grounding is an informative identity, which is also known as a synthetic reduction or a synthetic identity. Michael Humer gives 3 examples of informative identities, or what he calls synthetic reductions. Divine command theorists often compare the relation between good and God as being the same as the relation between water and H2O. They are both synthetic reductions or synthetic identities. Humer writes, divine command theorists takes rightness to be reducible and dependent on the attitudes of an observer, God. The divine command theory is a form of subjectivism. Here is a quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on moral non-naturalism. Moore in effect also argues that most forms of non-naturalism are also guilty of what he calls the naturalistic fallacy. So, for example, a view according to which goodness is the property of being commanded by God is also charged with having committed the naturalistic fallacy. This suggests that the naturalistic fallacy is not well named in that it is not specifically a problem for naturalists, and Moore admits as much. The real force of Moore's argument is supposed to be that attempts to reduce moral properties to anything else are doomed to fail. This is why Moore's own view of goodness as sui generis and irreducible is supposed to avoid the naturalistic fallacy. Since the reductionist anti-reductionist distinction cuts across the naturalist-non-naturalist distinction, this suggests that the real target of Moore's argument is reductionism rather than naturalism. G. E. Moore considered divine command theory a reductionist view. Thanks for watching.